think we're ready to go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar on Neolithic carved stone balls, which will be presented by Dr. Hugo Anderson-Whymark. And before we start, I would just like to give you a little bit of background to this talk. So this webinar is organised by Scotland's Rock Art Project. This is a 5-year programme working with communities across the country to record, research and raise awareness of prehistoric rock art carvings in Scotland. And the project is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and is run by Historic Environment Scotland in collaboration with Edinburgh Uni and Glasgow School of Art. And we are very thankful to Glasgow School of Art for hosting this webinar on their Zoom account. Some of Scotland's Rock Art Project team are here tonight with us, so I'll give a brief introduction. First of all, to myself, my name's Linda, and I'm the data analyst in the ScRAP team. We also have our principal investigator of ScRAP with us here tonight, which is Dr. Tertia Barnett, and our postdoctoral research assistant, Dr. Joanna Valdez-Tullett, our co-investigator, Dr. Stuart Jeffrey from the School of Simulation and Visualization at the Glasgow School of Art. And finally, Dr. Guillaume Robin, co-investigator from the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at Edinburgh University. So Scotland's Rock Art Project started in 2017 and it's the final year this year. And since it's our sort of last run now, we're organising a number of events to promote and celebrate Scotland's rock art and the work of the project and all our amazing community teams. So tonight talks is the fourth in a series of 12 webinars, which are running throughout this year. We have one each month, and the webinars are presented by experts from Britain and Europe on themes that are relevant to Scotland's rock art. You can find a lot more details on this on our website and also about other events that we are running. You will also find the recordings of previous webinars on our website if you weren't able to come to the other ones. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, there are a few housekeeping rules to be aware of. We are recording this talk. You should have been notified of that, and we will post it on our website in a week or two. To avoid background noise, everyone is muted throughout the webinar and your videos are also turned off, so don't worry about that. Please use the chat box if you want to talk to each other, if you want to tell us where you're joining from, and to flag up any technical issues that you might have. We would really appreciate it if you could keep the chat appropriate and relevant, so don't post any links and don't click on any links unless they're posted by one of our team members. And if you want to avoid the comments from the chat box from popping up on your screen, you can keep the chat box open on your right hand side. This will avoid the notifications from interrupting you. If you want to ask the speaker any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask the speaker questions throughout their talk. I will be presenting the questions to the speaker after their talk. So the chat for all the general chat and getting to know each other, and the Q&A for all the questions you may have. And now I'm really excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Hugo Anderson-Whymark. He is a senior curator responsible for the Paleolithic to Neolithic collections north of the Alps in the Department of Scottish History and Archaeology at the National Museums of Scotland here in Edinburgh. He is also an honorary reader in archaeology at the University of the Highlands and Islands. Tonight he will be speaking to us about portable art, Scotland's carved stone balls. So Hugo, if you want to share your screen, then we're ready for you.
Right, give me 1 second. Right. Okay, that should be there.
Perfect, thank you.
Excellent. Right, well, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you this evening. A slight sort of step sideways from rock art, because I'm talking to you specifically about these portable objects, carved stone balls, which are a very distinctive sort of artifact that we get in Scotland, broadly contemporary with a lot of the rock art we have, and one of the few Neolithic objects other than pottery that are really very highly decorated. So I'm going to focus just on this one artifact type today, give a real overview of the range of forms, the range of decoration, and sort of just make a few observations about how it relates to some of the rock art. So for those of you who aren't familiar with carved stone balls at all, I've got to put a selection of these up on the screen here. They're sort of unified by being quite a sort of similar sized group of objects. They're about palm size, so they're sort of about the size of a tennis ball. They generally sit very neatly in the palm of your hand. A few are a bit smaller than that, a few are a bit larger, but the vast majority are a very similar size. So I have a couple of replicas on my desk, which I might pick up every now and again to show you. So yeah, they're that sort of size. And the classic form has 6 symmetrically arranged knobs. So it's like this one at the top of the screen here. And about half of all carved stone balls are of this type. So there are about 520 of these known. The vast majority of these are from Scotland. And of these, about 250 are of this type. The others form a very diverse group. And so I've got just images of a few of them here on the screen. Some have many knobs, up to about 200 knobs on the surface of these carved stone balls. Others you can see here are incised with designs. And then even the sort of the common 6 knobbed forms have quite a lot of diversity. So you can see here the 2 at either side. One has very shallow knobs on the surface, the other one very deeply pronounced. So there's a big variety in the shaping of these objects and their decoration. Now, the thing that's very striking about these objects is that they have a very distinct regional distribution, and the vast majority come from northeast Scotland. Specifically Aberdeenshire. The main concentration is just up here. And again, about half of all carved stone balls come from that region. Very rich agricultural region. The vast majority have been picked up as sort of surface finds in that area. You can see that more in general, there's a sort of distribution of carved stone balls right up the east coast of Scotland, and that distribution drops off towards the west, although you get them in the Hebrides and further south too. But when we go outside Scotland, they're exceptionally rare indeed. There's 2 from England, there's a couple from Ireland, although Ireland has its own sort of plain stone ball tradition, and there's 1 carved stone ball from Norway. And the latter is a bit of an anomaly. It was reported in the 1940s. It was found in a clearance cairn, a modern clearance cairn, and we don't know when it got there. It's popularly been attributed to the Vikings taking it there, but it could have arrived in much more recent years. What we don't believe is it actually necessarily went there in prehistory. Now, the date of carved stone balls is something that has been a lot of debate over the years. Our thinking today is that most of them are late Neolithic in date, with some possible early Bronze Age examples. And the reason for us having very limited dating evidence is, as I said before, because most of these have been found as stray finds, and so lack that important archaeological context to allow us to accurately date them. The best dated examples, in fact, the only examples with close dates, come from Orkney. And one of the most recent discoveries has by far the closest date that we can attribute. And that's this example shown on the screen here, which was found at the Ness of Brodgar in 2013. I've put a little star on this plan of the site here to show where it was found. And it was found within the center of the largest building on site, this massive rectangular structure here. And it was put into that building at the point they were building buttresses within that interior to support the roof. So this appears to have been a special deposit placed just before they built those buttresses, and that has been dated, radiocarbon dated and Bayesian modelled that event to just before 2900 Cal BC, so well within that late Neolithic date. What's really interesting about this find is that under the opposite buttress, there was deposited a panel of rock art, very nicely incised rock art, and also some human bones. So a whole series of offerings, deposits placed before those buttresses were built. Now, a number of carved stone balls have also been found at ScRAP, but most of these were found in the 19th century up until the 1930s. And so we don't have the close sort of deposits or charred material from those deposits that we can accurately date. But all of these examples came from the second phase of activity, the one which has the upstanding buildings that you can see today, such as House 1 here that is rotating on the right of the screen. And this phase of activity, again, dates to somewhere between 2800 and 2400 BC. So again, good late Neolithic dates. And an indirect but very interesting line of dating comes from Knowth Passage grave. And it comes in the form of these two miniature beads. So very small, about 14 millimeters across, beads that were found with cremated deposits in the chamber at Knowth. So these, identified by my colleague Alison Sheridan and published by her, are again dated to slightly earlier than those dates in Orkney, so around 3300 to 2900 BC. And interestingly, these beads they aren't just beads of carved stone balls represented in this deposit, there are also beads of mace heads, miniature mace heads in that too. So a very interesting representation of those objects. So one thing I really wanted to touch on in this talk is the dating of these objects. And this sort of has a great relevance to how we think about the dating of rock art as well. Over the years, it's obviously been put in many different periods. There's been a lot of discussion about the date it was manufactured. And this is true of carved stone balls as well. You can see from the various different dates provided on the left-hand side of the screen that for more than 100 years, the date of carved stone balls was suggested anywhere between being sort of Bronze Age and up to sort of early Christian in date. So there's two schools of thought here, really. The first coming from Sir John Evans here, who in his book Ancient Stone Implements in 1876 described the decoration on the Towie ball as bearing relationships to what he was seeing on passage graves in Ireland. Now, this parallel is the one we accept today. At the time, obviously, passage graves were thought to be Bronze Age, which is why he suggested a Bronze Age date. But the way he was drawing, the sort of distinction he was drawing in the decoration is one which we recognize today. And actually, in his second edition, he also drew on a line of evidence from the Folkestone drums, which their top surfaces, again, decorated with very distinctive concentric circles, actually very similar to Towie, as well as various other motifs we often see on late Neolithic ceramics and the like. Now, the second line of evidence, the second argument over the date, was largely down to Scottish archaeologists. And here we see from 1874, we see John Alexander Smith suggesting a Pictish or Viking date. And then slightly later, we see Joseph Anderson, who was the director of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, suggesting an Iron Age to early Christian date. Now, he came to this conclusion about the date from a newly discovered bronze ball, which is up at the top of the screen here. This bronze ball, it's about half the size of a normal carved stone ball. It's only about 1.5 inches across, and it was found at Woolston in Lanarkshire. And you can clearly see the spirals on the surface of this object, that decoration in the style of Celtic art, that sort of the 10 style decoration. And Joseph Anderson felt that this was a close parallel for what he was seeing on the Elgin ball here and on the Towie ball. And that's how he published these in Scotland in Pagan Times in 1882, which came out of his Rhind lectures. We had, at the time, many people pointed out that that wasn't a close parallel for the designs. But because Joseph Anderson was such a strong voice in Scottish archaeology in the late 19th and early 20th century, we see that the suggestion that they're Iron Age in date really sticks. And so by the beginning of the 20th century, they're quite commonly said to be Iron Age in date. And this really persists for a very long while, this view. The only real addition to this argument was added by Gordon Childe in 1931, who considered them to be Pictish. And this comes out of, again, his work on ScRAP, which he believed was a Pictish settlement. And he also drew a parallel with the distribution of Pictish symbol stones, which follow a reasonably similar pattern to carved stone balls. Now, unfortunately for Childe, within a few years, Stuart Pigott had looked at the pottery from ScRAP and redated it to the late Neolithic. But what's really interesting in relation to the carved stone balls was that the implication that they are definitely Neolithic in date, those ones from ScRAP and Neolithic, wasn't actually put into print until 1951, when Stuart Pigott and Glyn Daniel, in their book on prehistoric art in Britain, actually specified that specifically. So we have 100 years where the date of these balls is up in the air. There's a huge amount of discussion about this. And in some ways, that long period of reflecting on the date had a sort of an influence on the way people looked at the archaeological context in which these objects were found in. And there was sort of not necessarily some good archaeology going on. Some lines of evidence were being ignored in the 19th century. Now, in particular, the lines of evidence that were ignored in Scotland were those that suggested that there were some prehistoric examples. And so here, John Alexander Smith, in his 1874 article, flagged the context in which a few were found, which sound quite prehistoric. One was found in a tumulus. Another was found with a boar's tusk in a field near a half-demolished tumulus. And this example shown here from Craig Begg in Ballater was found about a foot away from a short kist, which was surrounded by a small ring cairn on the top of the hill. Now, Smith was at pains to point out how loose these associations were because he believed they were a lot later in date. Now, if we think about this evidence now, there actually could well be pointing towards a prehistoric date. And particularly the last example is really interesting because what we now know is that in the Bronze Age, grave goods weren't just deposited within the kist, they were often deposited outside the kist. So this actually has quite a plausible association as something that was potentially buried in the Bronze Age. Now, another example that could well be an early Bronze Age example, and is this example from Stripes in Moray. This one was found in 1897 by a sort of farmer who was also a very keen antiquarian, excavated many archaeological sites on his land. And what's really interesting is that although he published this find as coming from a short kist, that's a context, a grave that they knew was going to be prehistoric in date. The National Museum chose to suggest that that interpretation was incorrect. And so we have correspondence with the National Museum from the finder, where he tells here that he took the balls out of the grave with his own hand. They were lying on the right-hand side by where the hand was. Yet, when this particular object came into the museum in 1928, there's a little note written beside that provenance which says this has not generally been accepted as correct. So even at that late stage, these possible prehistoric associations were being dismissed. And I think revisiting them really, helps us understand the context of these a little bit more. So certainly some late Neolithic and possibly deposition, possibly manufacture going into the early Bronze Age. It's worth looking at this ball again because if you see, it's slightly curious in its shape. Unlike most carved stone balls, it's more cubic in its form. And if you notice that the surface of this is very shiny, and that's because it's quite highly polished. And what's really interesting is most carved stone balls are actually only ground to a finish. They're not finely polished. So this stands out. And so you wonder if it's somehow been modified or even manufactured at a later date in time. So having said that I believe them all to be Neolithic and early Bronze Age, I do want to highlight some that have been found on later sites. Now, I think these examples are ones that were perhaps rediscovered in prehistory. They've had an afterlife effectively. They've been refound and repurposed at another period in time. And quite interestingly, a number of these seem to have been found at religious sites and early historic sites, important early historic sites. So we have one from the Abbey on Inchcolm Island. There was another found by a church tower in Angus. There was one found on the top of the Dunad Fort when they were excavating up there. And then another turned up in a collection of antiquities stored in the nunnery in Iona. No idea when it actually ended up in that building. But perhaps more interestingly again is that one was recently discovered in 17th century rubble in Tarbott's Old Parish Church at Port Mahomack. And that was in Martin Carver's excavations on that site. I don't believe these are chance associations. I think people were seeing something significant in these objects and finding a place to rebury them. Certainly when you look at some of these carved stone balls, there is a cross within that form, potentially something significant there. But also, I'm sure that in Aberdeenshire, there must have been some folklore associated with these objects. We get folklore, the elf shot with arrowheads and obviously the thunderbolts associated with axeheads. I'm sure that in a region where there were lots of these objects, there would have been some folklore, but it doesn't ever seem to have been documented, or at least I've never found any to date. But I think it's a really interesting possibility that these had a very specific association. Certainly, I know of one that was kept in a Bible box in the 19th century and brought out for evening prayers. So, returning to the bigger picture, I just want to talk a little bit about the background into the research of carved stone balls, because it's really interesting how this developed through the 19th century and into the 20th century. If we go back to 1851, this is when the story of carved stone balls really begins, because this is the first illustration of a carved stone ball that was published. And it appears in Sir Daniel Wilson's Archaeology and Prehistoric Annals of Scotland. Now, once you publish an illustration of something, other people realize that they have the same objects. And suddenly what we see is within a few years of the publication of this work, there's a lot of them coming out the woodwork. Some were already in antiquarian collections. There were 3 in the founding collection at the Hunterian. But others which have been stored on the mantelpieces of farmhouses and in other collections, people suddenly have a name for them, realize what they are, and they begin to start circulating. And what we see through the 19th century is a real boom in the collecting of these objects. Museums sort of scrabble to get their hands on them, and lots of very big private collections are also built up in the 19th century. So within 25 years, John Alexander Smith, when he produces this wonderful article for the Proceeding of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, he can document 40 examples of carved stone balls and a further 5 plain stone balls. And he makes the first attempt to try and classify these objects. And he documents them in incredible detail. It's a wonderful report, a little section, paragraph devoted to each, giving its provenance, its whereabouts, and the vast majority are illustrated with these wonderful woodcuts. And what's quite interesting is we begin to see balls that appear and disappear in the archaeological record. This one in the middle here is one that was in the Royal Collection at Balmoral, and we don't know the whereabouts of that carved stone ball anymore. So it's a record of a ball that we no longer have, but the others, we all know the whereabouts of these, and you will see some of these as photographs and 3D models later in the lecture. Now, moving forward in time to the early 20th century, the National Museum embarked on a big project to record all of the known carved stone balls in 1908. And Frederick Coles, who was the assistant keeper at the museum, tackled this task over 3 years until he left the museum in disgrace in 1911. But what he did leave at the museum was this wonderful archive. We have all the correspondence with various collectors, various museums about the carved stone balls they have. There are a lot of photographs in the collection which were sent to him. And some of these, again, incredibly valuable. This photograph of this carved stone ball from Orther in Orkney is the only known record of this carved stone ball. Its current whereabouts is not known, but we'll obviously be able to identify it when it turns up because it's such a distinctive object. And Coles left us a part-written manuscript as well, where again he tried to develop quite elaborate typology for recording these objects by the number of knobs on their surface. So a very rich archive. It's one at the museum where we're digitizing. We hope to make more accessible in the near future as well. It's we obviously have a lot of paper records at the museum that are invaluable to researchers, and it's good to be able to make those available when we can. Now, another archive we hold at the museum is Dorothy Marshall's card index and correspondence from her very extensive project on carved stone balls, which she undertook between the 1960s and 1980s. And she, again, documented around 387 examples. And what's quite interesting is that she actually saw all but a couple of these carved stone balls in person. If she didn't see it herself and record it, then generally it didn't make it to her list. So we see some of the examples on older lists dropping off Dorothy's list because she hadn't actually physically seen that object. But here we have a couple of examples of her card index. They're crammed full of photographs, illustrations, and again, good information about these objects. And again, we're in the process of digitizing these. So the culmination of Dorothy Marshall's work was another Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries Scotland article, just simply entitled Carved Stone Balls, which came out in 1977. And Dorothy developed this very elaborate typology, which sort of has 17 different types and subtypes of carved stone ball. It's based on the number of knobs they've got on the surface, the decoration, and also their shape and size as well for, say, particularly large examples. And what we see here, typology should always work for the analyst. And what we slightly struggle with the carved stone ball typology is that many of those distinctions don't seem to have a meaningful pattern to them. So when they're plotted out, the distribution's broadly the same, and there's nothing that jumps out as being a real significant difference. So it's quite challenging to use this typology in many ways. And it's also worth pointing out that not all carved stone balls have knobs on the surface at all. There's this example at the bottom here that is just a single spiral all the way around the form of that ball. And there are other objects which sort of sit, they're not necessarily carved stone balls, and it's where you draw that line, that cut-off line of what's a carved stone ball and what's not a carved stone ball. For example, Dorothy Marshall includes this object here on the right, which is, it has a flattened surface. You can see the decoration on it. It's decorated in concentric circles with a sort of zigzag design around the side. But there is a ground flat facet on that surface. And we at the museum classify this as a grain rubber. So it might be another allied type of late Neolithic artifact, but it's one that is a distinctive form of object, a distinctive form of decorated object, but one that is different to carved stone balls. And you'll also notice that within this catalogue, there isn't a category for just a plain stone ball. And obviously all carved stone balls have to start their life as a sphere. So there are cut-off points here which are potentially challenging in how we're looking at these objects. I should say Chris Stewart Moffat is developing a new typology and done a lot of research as part of his PhD. He's just been awarded on carved stone balls. We should hopefully see some sort of revised work on that coming out at some point in the future. So here's a very broad array of different carved stone balls to give you an idea of that huge variety of forms, from 4 knob types with very prominently defined knobs, a classic 6 knob type here with, you see, very shallow discs. The actual form of the original stone sphere is retained in this example. It's just the interspaces that have been worked. Whereas other examples have more rounded knobs. Some have retained these sort of decorated triangular interspaces. So we see a huge variety in the form and the surface finish of these objects. And these things are really difficult to capture in a typology. You know, we can see here the surface of this one is ground to a very rough finish. This one is ground smooth to, again, almost a polish, and each knob defined by a simple incised line. So there is a great deal of variety in the overall form and finish. And then if we look along the bottom row here, we have the forms that have sort of multiple knobs over their surface. And again, massive variety in the forming of those knobs, the spacing of them, and again, the individual shape, whether they're quite prominent or quite flat discs as well. So challenging to classify these objects. And then what we always get is the ones that just don't fit into any sort of logical pattern, like this one rotating on the bottom line here. And you can see it's got 5 prominent discs. It looks like it's going to be a standard 6 knob carved stone ball, but that top surface where there should be another disc is actually decorated in lots of small knobs. So it's a sort of cross between 2 designs. So it doesn't fit that normal picture of what we might expect. Now, I said that there's sort of, you know, that there are challenges in terms of the typology, but we can see some regional differences in the way carved stone balls are manufactured, or the design of carved stone balls in different regions. And Orkney is quite a distinctive region. You'll notice these 2 carved stone balls here have very distinctive pyramidal knobs, and that's a real feature of Orcadian carved stone balls. It's not generally found elsewhere. And you'll notice as well that not all of the carved stone balls in Orkney are spherical. So this example here from the Hall of Rendell is very much a sort of oval shape. When it was first found in the 1920s, it was said to look like a Mills bomb, so a hand grenade, which is a very apt description, really. And at ScRAP again, if we return to the far left here, there is this incredible object, which is, again, it's got elongated prongs coming out of the ends. So in essence, it feels like a carved stone ball, but the form is not spherical, and it's actually moving quite a long way from being spherical. And interestingly, in Orkney, we see this play in the form of objects. So we see a lot of sculpted stones in the late Neolithic, such as a pool in Sandy. The Neolithic settlement there were various prongs of objects found in the excavation at Coines Passage Grave. Again, there are pronged objects. One of them are three-pronged objects, much like this. And there seems to be this sort of spectrum which moves away from the spherical balls into other forms in Orkney. So this example from ScRAP here, again, you've got a very elaborate decorated center panel, but three prongs poking out the side. So there seems to be a sort of bigger spectrum of forms in Orkney, and again, a move away from spheres into other shapes, particularly these pointed forms. So there's a certain degree of play, whether that's chronological or whether it is just a regional variation, has yet to really be demonstrated. Now, I also want to point out this carved stone ball in particular, which was found at Hillhead, which is just outside Kirkwall in Orkney. As I think it's a really interesting example, because you have effectively in this center panel what looks to be one of those Orcadian pyramidal knobbed carved stone balls. But the vast majority of the surface is covered in this spiral, which begins at the top and goes right the way to the bottom, where there is this sort of elaborate sort of weaving pattern. And this is, I think, and I wonder if this is actually a representation of a carved stone ball that is bound in a cord of some kind. So it's a representation of a binding perhaps carved into that stone. Particularly at the top here, where you have that very neat little tuck in that spiral at the top, it seems to be a very genuine representation. And again, this style of sort of almost binding, where you're getting those cords crossing at the bottom. So I do wonder if this is an example of actually how carved stone balls might have looked in the Neolithic when they had an organic binding on them. Now, having sort of said that there were lots of difficulties in how we try and classify these objects, there has been a really useful piece of work done recently by Andy Jones and Marta Diaz-Gardanimo, which was published as Making a Mark back in 2019. And there was a whole chapter devoted to carved stone balls in this book about decoration on late Neolithic sort of portable objects. And it's a really interesting shift in thinking about these objects. Rather than trying to force them into distinct classifications, so you can see here, this array of carved stone balls would be three different types of Marshall's category. But Andy and Marta thought it better to look at these as objects of process. So objects that potentially change and develop over time. So they don't stay a static form, they evolve and they change and they take on a different shape as they move through their life. Now, this is a quite interesting concept, because the way we think about making something is you conceive that form, you go out and you execute it. But if we think of these objects as being things that do more gradually evolve, they become a stone sphere, it's marked out, the triangular interspaces that you can see on on this one at this end are then removed, then the discs are made more prominent. We have a far better understanding about how these objects could have evolved over time, that they might not be something that is simply made in one form at one time, but things that change. And so this can bring in, that idea about these objects might have had a very long biography. They could have had quite long lives, because it's not necessarily one person who's changing that. It could be as the ball passed through different hands, different people add and shape and change the form, the surface finish, and the decoration of these objects. And potentially you could erase former patterns and former marks on the surface as well as you develop this form. So it's quite useful in moving us away from thinking about what each individual type means as to what the overall class of objects is about. So just to give you a bit of an example of that on one carved stone ball, I've put up this example from Sheriff Muir that was discovered in 2018 and recently went through Treasure Trove and was allocated to Perth Museum. Now there's a 3D model in the middle here, which I've stripped away the surface texture so it's a shiny metal shade. And this allows you to see the detail in the working. And if you look at these triangular areas in the middle as they come around, what you'll see is they're much rougher than the rest of the surface. And under the microscope, what you can observe is that the pecking that has removed these triangular areas cuts through the grinding on the surface. So this carved stone ball once had those raised triangular interspaces, and at a later point in time, they've been removed. So again, potentially a sequence, and potentially one where it was ground to quite a nice finish before they were removed. So the form has changed there. And interestingly, if we look at the decoration on the surface of this, we see another interesting pattern. There's two decorated discs on this carved stone ball. This first one has a lattice pattern. You can see that quite clearly. And the other one, a series of 5 parallel lines. Now the lattice is, under the microscope, what you could see was that the carved stone ball was, that those lines were probably cut using a piece of leather or something and a flint as a, flint's very effective at cutting lines in stone, but using a piece of leather as a ruler to basically cut a very clean line across that surface. There's no evidence of any marking out. It's just very neatly incised, very crisply across that surface. And what we could see under the microscope was that all the lines were incised in one direction before rotating it and creating the lattice in the opposite direction. Whereas when we look at the second disc, you can see that actually the process of manufacturing that, you can see the lines, they aren't as regular, they're slightly wider than the other incisions, but under the microscope you could see lots of little scratches across the surface. So the flint was not cut neatly in one swift move, it was basically scratched. Each line was scratched out before it was eventually made deeper. So you have here on one object two very different ways of cutting a line. So that could be that it was the same person doing it at a different point in time, or it could be two different people adding decoration to that object. But again, it makes us think that these could have a longer biography, that there was a considerable length in the process to making these objects. Now, there are also examples which suggest there were far more distinctive changes in the designs of carved stone balls over time. They didn't just make the pre-existing discs more prominent, some seem to have changed entirely in their form. So this first carved stone ball on the left here, it has 24 knobs. And if you notice on this front area, they're in a group of 4, and there's sets of 4 knobs across the surface of this ball. And if I draw a line around those, I think you can see what I'm suggesting is that this carved stone ball could potentially have been a 6-knobbed carved stone ball originally, before each knob was divided into 4 and turned into sort of separate miniature knobs. So we've potentially got an entire transformation in the form of that object, into one which had 6 large knobs, into one which is covered in multiple small knobs. In these middle 2 examples, you can again see that process of large discs marked on the surface here, gradually being reworked at the side there into smaller knobs. And this has been abandoned partway through that process of turning those bigger discs into smaller knobs. And the lower example, it's been completed over the whole surface. And what we have is just, we have a line that goes all the way around the object, which is very deeply incised and is clearly the trace of an earlier design on the surface that has been all but removed by the creation of those hundreds of small knobs. So there is some quite a large transformation in the form of that object. And then the final one on the side here, you have two views of the same object. And again, it's like the one I showed earlier, where one side of the object, one view, appears to be a sort of standard 6-knob carved stone ball, but when you turn it over, where the missing disc should be, there is in fact a rosette of smaller knobs, and the interspaces are again filled with smaller knobs on that surface. So this one's quite interesting because we can't see the trace of that disc running around, and it's quite possible that this one just physically changed, what was being manufactured just changed during the course of being manufactured. It wasn't that they created a disc here and replaced it, but as it was being manufactured, it just started to be made into something else. And so again, that sort of play with forms and combinations of different forms, something that's very interesting going on in the manufacture of these. Now, one of the things that is really interesting about these objects is the decoration, and the incised decoration in particular. And there are, of the 500 or so known examples, just over 50 have incised decoration on their surface. The Towie ball at the top left here, which I'm again putting into metallics so you can sort of see the working on the surface somewhat better. But incredibly fine, detailed, incised work. And as has sort of been mentioned already, this finds its parallels in the passage grave art, which extends up the west coast from Ireland to Orkney. These incised circles, spirals, sort of groups of motifs are very common on carved stone balls. And so you can see some of the more sort of curving designs grouped together here, the concentric circles, often marked with a chevron at their edge, spirals that may be in the interspaces or prominently marked on the knobs. Again, very commonly associated with concentric circles here. And again, these sort of cupules or sort of shallow dimples marked out on the surface. And what's really interesting about the decoration of these objects is that we don't just see it necessarily as fine incised lines, we see some marked out in 3D as well. So we have here these concentric circles dressed as far broader three-dimensional lines, and this very uncommon group of carved stone balls, all found in Aberdeenshire, that are a single spiral from one end of the object to the other. And there's about 6 or 7 of those from Aberdeenshire. So a very sort of interesting representation of some of these marks. It's worth flagging that there are a lot of more angular geometric designs as well, represented on carved stone balls. And these take, there's some examples here which, they're often, it's not necessarily every disc of a carved stone ball will be marked. For example, on this one, there's just the one disc that is marked with parallel lines. But in some cases, more of those knobs are decorated. And you can see here, there are various patterns of lattice work. There are some more radial designs with sort of nested V's, with lattice designs in the other areas. We see more rarely triangular decoration in the which is quite commonly in the interspaces. This very fine example here, each interspace decorated with a slightly different motif, And again, very unusual, but quite significant. We see the sort of, again, this zigzag, which is such a common feature of that passage grave art, as well represented on just part of this ball. And quite interestingly, cross designs as well seem to be a feature of some carved stone balls, many which are decorated again with the small sort of dimples, little cupules on those surfaces in various different designs. And certainly in Andy Jones's work, they were finding some layering of these different designs, incised lines, overlying cupules, and so on. Now, the final example here, you can see, is almost entirely defined by incised decoration, the design on this object. But you can see the disc in the foreground, the knobs have actually been carved from a lattice. So these first two knobs are incised into lattices, but the third knob has been worked even further, the one that's just coming into view again. And you can see that lattice work has been refined into lots of small knobs across the surface. So it does appear, again, this process of constantly working and reworking, adjusting the decoration on these objects is something that was often happening through their lives. Now, there are some interesting hints at sort of regional patterning in designs and carved stone balls. These top row here, the spiral carved stone balls, these are only found in Aberdeenshire. But the other carved stone balls that are decorated with spirals are also most commonly found in Aberdeenshire or immediately adjacent counties. Beyond that area, they're quite uncommon. And you'll notice as well that spiral decoration on four-knobbed carved stone balls is also quite a prominent feature. So there is some association of that specific form with that style of decoration. Now, interestingly, the more angular designs, these parallel lines, the lattice work, is actually a feature of other parts of Scotland. You can see here that if we go into Perthshire and Fife, that's where we find more commonly these other forms of decoration. And actually, you see here, they extend further west into Argyll, one in Islay, and one up in Inverness as well. So there's a real interesting distribution. This sort of pattern seems more characteristic of areas outside Aberdeenshire, whereas spirals are within Aberdeenshire. Now, this is something I've not looked at in any great degree of detail, but I think it would be really interesting to mine down into this a little bit more and try and understand that patterning a little bit better. So I'm sort of getting towards the end of my talk. I can't talk about carved stone balls without touching on what they were actually used for. And I've put up a series of the interpretations that have been offered for these objects on the screen here. Now, there are a huge variety of interpretations. They vary from very practical interpretations, sort of weights and measures, hot boilers, to uses in practices such as divination, or a very recent suggestion, which is very interesting, is that they could be an oral history device. So Lynn Kelly, back in a few years ago, proposed, on the basis of sort of drawing parallels with objects from Africa and objects used by Aborigines in Australia, that these could be rotated in the hand, used to help recall that oral history of society that would have been so important when you obviously didn't have a written record. There are some more outlandish suggestions here, like there were ball bearings to move standing stones. But to be honest, many of these suggestions have some degree of plausibility. And I think what we see so often with these is a focus on just one specific interpretation, but they often could have had many different uses and potentially different uses over time as well. So I'm going to not use the words mysterious, not use the words enigmatic, but more suggest that there are many possible interpretations. Now, one I want to sort of dwell on a bit, because it's a very long-lasting interpretation, is that of their use as weapons. And we see here two sort of key suggestions. Sir John Evans thought that they could be strung together like South American bolas, like this one's shown in the image here, probably, you know, using the grooves as a way of tying cords around the object. Whereas John Smith in 1874 felt that they would be mounted like maceheads, and he drew on an image of the Bayeux tapestry to sort of show how that might work. So each suggestion could arguably work. The Towie ball here in the middle, you notice the three prominent discs, but no one ever looks at the bottom because one of those discs is entirely undecorated. So plausibly, that could be the one that's mounted against a stick and hafted that way. But with all of these interpretations, what we see is a challenge to how, you know, whether this could work as an interpretation. Certainly the Towie ball has decorated interspaces. If you were to tie it to anything, that decoration would be hidden. And in other examples, such as this one from Glasgow Museum, virtually all the decoration is actually in the interspaces. If you bound it, that would be entirely hidden decoration. So there are challenges to how we interpret those objects. But I think there is a good argument that they could have been used as weapons. If you actually ever hold a carved stone ball, most of them weigh between ½ kilo and ¾ kilo in weight. They're very heavy. They could inflict quite a lot of damage. If we look at other contemporary objects in the late Neolithic, the real other prestigious object we see at that time is maceheads. And you can see again, these two maceheads from Orkney here, those flat surfaces, not dissimilar in size to a carved stone ball, and the objects themselves not dissimilar in weight. So they could have been used to deliver blunt force trauma. And what we certainly know is that the Neolithic wasn't necessarily a pleasant place. There were elites vying for power, building immense monuments, immense structures like at the Ness of Brodka. And this certainly wouldn't have been necessarily entirely peaceful. And we can see that in some of the Neolithic human remains. So work by Angela Boyle and colleagues recently at Queen Tomb has revealed this large depression fracture that occurred either at the point of death or shortly afterwards, created by a blunt object. Could have been a macehead, could have been a ball, could have been something else that, again, could deliver a blunt force trauma, a very heavy blow to that skull. And what we also see in Orkney is a number of cattle that are killed by poleaxing. So they're struck on their skulls to be killed. And if we think about cattle in the Neolithic, they were such an important resource. They were effectively your wealth on the hoof. And so to kill an animal was, again, a very significant event. And you might well have had a weapon or an object specifically dedicated to such a task. Now, there's little denying that many of these objects are, in fact, incredible works of Neolithic art. They are so finely decorated. Wonderful example of a craftspeople at work. The elaborate decoration on many of these carved stone balls is unsurpassed. They took a huge amount of time to make. And a lot of that time would have been in making the sphere, but that elaborate surface decoration is also incredibly well executed. Now, these do obviously sit up there with other prestigious objects in the late Neolithic, like maceheads, like some of the finer axe heads we see. And I think it's interesting that, you know, that interpretation that these could be objects of sort of power, status, they certainly could hold that role. Now, this this sort of role could have come over the period of time. So we said we've got several hundred years that these objects were in use. It might be that individual objects gained significance as they passed through many hands. They were objects that had that story of all the people had held them, the biography of the peoples and places they'd been. So they could have been significant through that. And again, the more elaborately decorated examples might have been ones that had, had been at some significant event and warranted being developed from perhaps quite a mundane, functional carved stone ball into something more elaborate that had, a particular status role attached to it. But I think, again, we're seeing that there are objects which potentially had multiple different uses. They potentially weren't all used the same way. And you could again put many different interpretations to them. I think that's kind of what makes them exciting, is that still today we can come up with new ideas about how they were used and what they were for. What we really need to do is find more of them in context, preferably some in Aberdeenshire, to actually better understand the context in which they were being used in the Neolithic. So I think I've talked enough now, so I'll end now, but I will flag that there are lots of 3D models of carved stone balls online. Most of those from the National Museum's collections can be seen on our Sketchfab account. On my personal Sketchfab account, there's lots from other museums as well. And do get in touch if you have anything interesting you want to discuss with me. So I'll hand back to the chair, if that's okay.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Really fascinating. To be honest, I didn't know much about Neolithic carved balls until today, but really interesting to see how they also kind of pop up later in history, like in these long biographies of the object. You've got plenty of questions, so I hope you're ready to answer some of them. Let's see. So Norman is asking, what types of rock is used to create the ball? Is the rock generally a local deposit, or is it special rock brought from afar, or even a specific site?
That's a very good question, and that's exactly what I forgot to say at the beginning. So yeah, in that first slide, you're seeing a huge range of rocks. Some are made from sandstone, some are made from granite, some are made from igneous rocks. Those in Orkney are often made from the local dike rocks that you get up there. So a huge variety. They are more often than not rocks that you get from those regions. So they're not necessarily traveling far, they're being made in those areas. I'm sure some traveled, but there is a huge diversity. So we don't think they're from a quarry. They were probably, the easiest way to get a nearly spherical rock is to pick up a cobble. Cobbles are mostly oval and they work it from that. So I think that they're representative of the regions they come from. But they went for a variety of different colors. But if you notice, there's a lot of quite muted tones, black coloring. And, when you look at maceheads, which were going for color, banding, sparkly, pretty rocks, there is clearly a different aesthetic to that they were deliberately going for in the rocks they were choosing. But the type of rock didn't matter. Clearly, you could make one very quickly from sandstone. Really hard metamorphic rock was going to take you a bit longer, but that didn't seem to be a particular matter.
A question from myself then, just related to that. Have you seen any correlation between, for instance, the type of rock and the type of design? I mean, that's something we're looking at in ScRAP specifically, so I'm just wondering if it's something that you've read about or looked at yourself.
No, to be honest, there's been very limited work done on geological sourcing of these rocks. So it's something we do need a lot more geological work done across all of the carved stone balls in Scotland, is actually IDing them, looking at the source areas, looking at the properties and yes, characteristics. At the moment, we've got a lot of antiquarian terminology on our database, and that is something that could be done as a good project.
So still work to be done, even if they've been researched for well over 100 years now. Yeah. A question from Liz. What examples are there rather than the bronze ball, of balls which have been created later, possibly as imitations, which are actually accepted as Neolithic but are not? Or perhaps as a wider question, how would you know?
The Woolston ball, they think that's about 500 AD. It's not really a close parallel to a carved stone ball because, as I said, it's about half the size. It does have decorated panels, but they're not set out in a very similar way. So, I mean, it really comes down to that short list of examples I put up of ones found on or close to other sites, which there's, I suppose we don't necessarily have that many associations where you can demonstrate precisely where they are in a later context. They're often it's because they're from that site or from that area. Particularly those people who sort of that they were an Iron Age thing would often write that they were found 500 meters from a broch. That's a long way away.
Yeah.
That's so I don't know. I don't think there really are imitations. There obviously are the spherical objects, and there's lots of hammerstones and other things that have been called stone balls, but they're not decorated in the same way. So there are things that are similar, but I don't think many are imitating it at a later period of time. What I'm interested in is how they were used at a later period of time. Particularly, the story about one of these carved stone balls sitting in the Bible box and being brought out for evening prayer. It's a lovely sort of example of how something took on an entirely new significance when it came into someone's hands, and that was in the early 19th century. And that one, we know it was known about from the early 19th century, but it only came into the museum's collections in 2003. So it spent a long time with a one family basically.
It's quite interesting as well if its original purpose, say, was to symbolize something ritual, like a ritual deposit, and its continued use that later, still in a modern ritual context.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that intrigues people is the fact that it being a ball, it doesn't have an obvious function. And I think that's the thing, is that with, say, an axe head, that it has a function. It can chop down a tree. Obviously, there's a lot of axe heads made of jadeite or exotic rocks or finished exceptionally finely that were clearly never designed for chopping down trees, but we don't question their function in the same way that we do for these objects. So I think there's something about the variety of the shapes that really catches the imagination.
Yeah. Right. Question about residue analysis. Is there any chance of residue analysis of carved stone balls? The difference in stone porosity will matter, and no doubt the destructive nature of the analytical technique to collect the sample required versus the rarity of the balls, but wondered if you knew if it was being carried out or contemplated.
No one's tried it. And part of the reason of that is that so many of them in museums are literally thick and black with handling grease and all sorts. So where something has been in a museum for 200 years, it's going to have all sorts of residues on it that will be very difficult to explain or say were in the past. So what we really need is the new balls to be analysed, but I don't think that's taken place on any of the new examples. And some of the rocks, like the one from the Ness of Brodgar, is a very non-porous sort of basalt. So I'm not sure that there would be a residue in that. There could potentially be some residues on the surface. Some of the blackening looks a bit, as if it's applied to these objects, but that's something that could do with further testing. But again, we don't know the history of many of these objects before they came to the museum, so it might be that we find out it's 19th century paint or boot polish or wax. People did all sorts of things to them in the past.
Yeah. Is the most recent find of Neolithic carved stone ball in context then from Ness of Brodgar, or where is the most recent find that has been made?
Well, there was the one I mentioned from Sheriff Muir that came in, but that was found by a member of the public, tree planting. and that came through treasure trove. But the
Mm-hmm.
precise spot it was found, but it was in topsoil when it was found. But it was within a late Neolithic artifact scatter. But the one from the Ness of Brodgar is the only one in recent years that's found in a good archaeological context, besides the one at Tarbert that was found in the 17th century context. So no, we desperately need some more found in good Neolithic context. And I said, preferably in the heartland of Aberdeenshire, where so many have been found as surface finds.
Then we have a question about, well, this is a good one from Gabrielle. Are there two which are alike? They all look unique.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah.
There are. So the Towie ball there are 2 or 3 carved stone balls that look very similar to Towie. And there are a few that look like broadly similar. So that one that has the raised concentric circles, there's 2 that are near identical of that. So yeah, there are some that look like very similar to one another. But whether they're copies, whether they were meant to be pairs or copies of something you'd seen and replicated would require, again, lot further analysis. And I really hope by creating a collection of 3D models of all of these objects, we can do that sort of closer comparison, because many are spread across museums across Scotland and beyond.
That's the problem as well, when you have the stuff in private collections as well that have been just been passed down through generations, maybe in a drawer or, as you said, on the mantelpiece. Then having that 3D model will at least be something that can be used, you know. Do we have any idea how much time / effort such intricate carvings would have taken with Neolithic tools?
Yes, well, there are people who make them. There's a colleague, Chris G, up in Orkney, who makes carved stone balls up there, and it depends very much on the rock you're working. So if you're making them in sandstone, it can be relatively quick. If you're making them in Orcadian, the dike rocks they use in Orkney actually grind really well with a piece of sandstone, so you can shape them quite quickly. So actually, often the final decoration is quicker than making the generic sphere of stone, because obviously, unless you're on a very high power storm beach, stones aren't spherical. You need, they're going to be oval to some degree. So you're going to spend a lot of time getting a perfect sphere. And there's often this elaborate process between you peck a sphere out of the rock, you then grind that smooth, you then incise a line that you incise the design, then you peck out the design and grind it out. So there's all this layering of different practices, which is quite similar to rock art in some ways, in the different processes you might go through in making that object. But in terms of time, it's not necessarily, I don't know, I wouldn't want to put a time on doing something like a Towie ball, but in terms of grinding the grooves out on that, that's just 4 or 5 hours work.
Okay.
It's not necessarily not huge, and that's a really hard rock. If you were doing a sandstone, it's a lot quicker. So not necessarily hugely time consuming, but it depends how precise you're being, because that one is not, they're not precisely executed. Whereas some carved stone balls are incredibly accurate, others are less so. So there is a spectrum in the quality of the work.
Cool. Related to that, we've got a question about the tools. So what kind of tools were used for the fine carving? Was it potentially something more specialist than flint flakes that you mentioned?
A flint flake is a very good tool. But no, the interesting thing, I suppose, it's like many things. What you need is a hammerstone, which obviously you'd be using a hammerstone for a variety of tasks in the Neolithic. You generally need something with it to get a groove even like that. You need something with a sharp edge. So sandstone works very well as the sort of sandpaper of your day. So a variety of different finely shaped edges is a very useful way of getting that. But really, the fine incisions are a flint does work very well to do that task, even on the quite hard rocks. It's the the one thing that holds that very, very sharp edge, or that very thin edge, for when you're trying to get the narrowest lines. Quite interestingly, there are, on some of the sort of early stages, you have this almost millimeter wide sort of ground line around where they want to mark out where they subsequently make the knobs. But that I've not found what tool they use for that, because it clearly is something that they're rubbing around it, grinding around it, but it's incredibly thin, and the accuracy with which they do it is really precise.
So be like a string? No, or
well, it must be something quite abrasive. But I suspect they had a whole range of different grades of the sandstone, different types of rock, different different hardnesses to actually cover those eventualities. But for the detail, I mean, flint is definitely the precisest. And actually, even on Towie, if you get some very high resolution photographs of it, you can see where the original sort of very fine incision has come off. So there are some fine scratches that come out the ends of the spiral. So we can see that they basically were scratching it out and then finishing it with a sort of, using a flint to just shave that out. So I think, yeah, fine detail is going to be flint.
So can we go into your sketch fab and see this, look for this process of the flint scraping, or?
So they're reasonably high resolution, a lot of the models on there. But as I say, for some of that very fine detail of those finest scratches, you do need to use a microscope to actually get that finer detail coming out. So, but you can see, if you go to the Towie ball, lots of the 3D models, you can remove the surface texture, so you can look at it like it's in metal, which just helps you visualize that detail in the surface. So, and you can see an awful lot of that detail in the Towie ball.
Very cool. We've got a question about how do you think the measurements were worked out to create the discs?
I don't know, because some are quite precise, but they're not all of the discs are perfectly circular. Not all of the discs on a carved stone ball are perfectly symmetrical, but you do have some where they have the incised lines and they're around a central point. So it is almost as if they've used a sort of compass to set them out. Some of them are that precise, but I mean, a lot of it seems to have been freehand working. But as I say, for the finest ones, there is a very high degree of symmetry. But really interestingly, the Towie ball, it's got 4 knobs, but it looks perfectly symmetrical. But it was only when I made the 3D model and tried to set it up, it's not. It doesn't pivot on a central axis. It's actually not perfectly shaped at all. It has that appearance, but it's not finished to that that degree of minute accuracy. But it looks like it.
That's maybe the most important bit, it to look right rather than actually being like that.
Yeah.
We've got a question about whether analysis would be able to determine if the balls were made by a specific creator, like brushstrokes for a painter.
I'd hope so, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think, again, we could have a look again at the detail of the styles of the object. And certainly where there's the incision, you do get, you'd have seen, Towie is very finely executed, but other spirals on other stones are less well executed. So you might see that detail in the finer decoration. I'm not sure you'd get it from how a hammerstone was being used or how something was being ground. Particularly, obviously, if you're using a sharp edge tool to grind it, you're effectively wearing the tool away as well. So that's going to be constantly changing as you're making that object. So I'd like to think so, but I'm not sure we will get that much detail.
Yeah. Coming back to the question of geometry and symmetry, could they be a way, so could the carved stone balls be a way of recording geometric knowledge in a culture that didn't use paper?
Yeah, well, it is an interesting, there's been a great deal of interest in the geometry of these objects, and that, back in the 70s and 80s, it was about them being representations of platonic solids. But as I hope I've shown, that there is a classic photo of them all, which 10 years ago on the internet, if you search carved stone ball, you would pretty much find the one image of those carved stone balls, and it looked like you had an example of each of the platonic solids. But the thing is, one of them actually, it was marking out the interspaces, not the knobs. So we're missing one of the platonic solids. But actually, you see here, you've got 3, you've got 4, you've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So you've got a huge variety of combinations. So you're obviously going to cross over at some point. But yeah, the question of them playing with symmetry is, I think, quite interesting. They clearly were working very hard to divide these out, create some degree of regularity. And yes, I think there is something of interest related to that, but it's difficult to see what it is. There's obviously so many variations, and again, what I hope is that we can, by looking at the full data set, by creating more models, bringing together more images, we will see that diversity and hopefully see if there are any patterning within that.
That's the thing, yeah. It's the same for rock art as well. How will we get close to the meaning of it unless we actually look at them and characterize them? Yeah. I don't know if you mentioned this at the start, but we've got a question from Philippa that is asking, are the balls all the same size?
Well, they broadly are. So the vast majority are 65 to 75 mil across. So they are that size, they fit in your hand like that. There's 1 or 2 that are a bit smaller, and there's 1 or 2 that are, well, not 1 or 2, I think it's about 10 or 15 that are sort of about 90 or 100 mil. So they're significantly bigger. But interestingly, in the past, if it didn't fit within that bracket, we immediately called it a fake. So so in some ways we have this sort of play of some of the larger ones that were dismissed as fakes because they didn't fit within that size. I don't think we can necessarily dismiss all of them that way. There are 1 or 2 clear fakes, but yeah, very similar. That's the one consistent thing they have, far more than the design, is that they fall in a very similar size bracket.
And is that also the same with the weight then? That is quite a similar weight range you mentioned.
No, because they're made of different rocks.
Oh yeah, of course.
So obviously a sandstone will weigh half the amount as some of the heavier metamorphic and igneous rocks. So that suggestion that they're a standard weight is, that doesn't work at all, because there's actually a really big diversity in that.
Cool. Kate is asking, has any practical archaeology been done with them? For instance, firing them out of a sling, etc.
No, it's something I think I'd like to do. I know Ange Boyle would like to experiment that with some of the weapons as well, because it is a really interesting, how they could be used, and then what sort of damage that would inflict on the surface of these objects. We do have 1 or 2 that have broken discs or nicked discs. There's one from ScRAP, one of the ones with the pyramidal knobs, where you can see the knob has been fractured and they've reground around the edges of it. So certainly there is some damage on some of these that might be caused from use. But so it'd be interesting to put them to test, as it were. You do, well, as you might expect, not many of these are found as broken objects, but that could be an effect of collecting, in that perhaps where it comes to most of them being casual finds, only the whole ones were kept. But there are only, there's not a huge number of ones that are broken in half in museum collections. So yeah, it's a good possibility. We could do some experiment work.
Absolutely. Now the lockdown restrictions is lifting and we can go outside in summer, maybe. Throw some balls around.
see how damaging they are. It depends.
Exactly.
Yeah, it depends if you have that view of a peaceful Neolithic or one where it's slightly more violent.
Elaine is asking, will there ever be exhibition of all known carved stone balls together, perhaps a travelling exhibition in Scotland or similar.
That would be lovely. They are, as I said, they're in dozens of different museums. National Museum Scotland has the biggest collection, and I would see more of ours on display. We have about 10 on display in the museum, and then they're spread across different areas. So,
Okay.
and there is actually at the moment, we've just opened up today, and there is a special exhibition on carved stone balls. Just one case with about a dozen of them in. If you get a chance to go into it and see it, it's still up for a couple more months. But that, yeah, it would be wonderful to see more of them together. And as I say, we've got about 140 originals, casts of others. We could bring a lot more of our collections out onto public display. They're currently just available for research. But yeah, many other museums. Aberdeenshire has a huge collection of carved stone balls too. So it would be lovely to see a lot more of them.
Yeah, bringing them all together like a family. Oh, related to this, someone just asked, are any on display outside the UK?
There's one at the Hunt Museum in Ireland. There's Pitt Rivers Museum has some. The Ashmolean has some, which I think are on display. Outside the UK, beyond that, I'm not sure. I'm not sure there are on display. I know one or two have gone abroad, but they're in private hands. So I'm not sure.
What happened to the Norwegian one? The one that was a bit of an anomaly.
Oh, that is in a museum, actually. I can't remember off the top of my head which is it. Trondheim Museum it's in. It might well be.
Yeah.
So it is still
Okay.
it's still there. I don't know if they got it on display.
Coming back to the differing weights of the carved stone balls, is there, for instance, a similar weight associated with a similar carving? So whether there's a correlation between weight and design motifs?
Again, there could be. It's not that's been looked at. So again, it's sort of more work required.
Oh, there's a Sheila Barnard saying, I've seen them in Naples Museum.
Well, there are other similar balls in different periods and different places. So there's some ceramic versions of sort of these balls in Russia, but they're of a very different sort of period. So it could be a similar thing in a different culture, but yeah.
We've got a question coming, probably one of the million questions. Given the spread of other artifacts throughout England, Wales, and Ireland, why do you think these are only found in Scotland?
Well, I think that they might have served a purpose that was covered in other regions by other objects. So I think in Orkney you get, say, a lot of maceheads. So you don't have many carved stone balls in Orkney, but you have over 100 maceheads, which is a lot for a small archipelago. And Aberdeenshire, you've not got hundreds of maceheads by any means, but you've got a lot of carved stone balls. So I wonder if these objects serve slightly different purposes in different places. We obviously do have a lot of long distance connections here. So, the motifs that are being represented on these balls connect, Aberdeenshire to Orkney to Ireland. These are very long distance connections. If we look at the Ness of Brodgar, you have Arran pitchstone coming in from down on the west coast. You have some of the maceheads are made of Lewisian gneiss that are heading across from sort of the Hebrides directions into Orkney. So we've got these long distance contact. There is some Den of Bodham type flint from Aberdeenshire that's at Barnhouse as well. So we have things and people moving these long distances. And I just wonder if certain aspects of the material culture are just being used slightly differently or more prominently in some areas than others. But there are shared aspects of the designs or use that they perhaps fit within. So as I mentioned, Ireland doesn't have many decorated carved stone balls, but it does have plain stone balls, which are broadly contemporary. So they could have served, again, a similar purpose, but be a slightly different object. And what they have as carved stone balls represented as those miniature that perhaps referencing a different area.
They were very cute, the miniature little bead there. I know it's just 7 now, but I want to ask you one final question just to round off, and maybe it's a bit of a mean one, but are there any links between carved stone balls and the rock art?
I think the links are through the working of the stone. So a similar range of techniques and tools, the picking, the grinding, the incising. That's a common link between that working of stone. Um, there's the uh, there's the motifs. I'm sure, I'm often struck by that little clustering you get of the small knobs in a little rosette. It almost looks like some of the rosettes you see in rock art.
Yeah.
Then in terms of the incised decoration, obviously the parallels we're seeing that are all within, or largely within, rock art. So I think it's a different medium, but I think we are seeing those. We can see those parallels through those designs. So that would be my link. That's hopefully why I'm talking here today.
Yeah, I mean they are contemporary as well, late Neolithic, so it would be the same people creating perhaps the rock art and the carved stone balls. Thank you so much for being here today. We're reaching the end of the webinar, and thank you for taking the time to answer all the questions. It's been really, really interesting, and I've learned a lot. Thank you for everyone for attending as well, and for being here tonight. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. We will have another webinar, I didn't mention at the start, we have webinars every month, but the next one will take place on Monday, the 24th of May. Registration is already open on our webpage, so you will find all the info there. And at the next webinar, we will hear about Northwestern Iberian rock art from Dr. Carlos Rodriguez Reyan from the Universidade Nova de Lisboa in Portugal. So I hope I'll see plenty of you there then, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you.